the island did not wake so much as loosen its hold on darkness. At first there was only the sound, water moving in its long patient rhythm against the rock, a steady unfolding that seemed to belong not to any particular morning but to something older, something that did not concern itself with days at all. Then gradually light pressed through the fog, not in a clear arrival, but in a kind of quiet negotiation, as though it were asking permission to remain. Ellen Harrow stood on the narrow porch and watched the shoreline come into being. It happened in increments, a darker shape where the rocks lay, a pale suggestion of the tide's edge, the faint movement of water where it gathered and withdrew. Nothing revealed itself fully at once, and she had long ago stopped expecting it to. She held a cup of coffee between her hands, though it had cooled enough that the warmth was no longer noticeable. Still, she did not set it down. There was a steadiness in the gesture that she found difficult to abandon, as if the act of holding something, even something that no longer served its purpose, offered a kind of continuity she had come to rely on. She had been awake since before the first light, though she could not say precisely when sleep had left her. It had become less distinct over the years, no longer a clear boundary, but something that thinned gradually until she found herself on the other side of it, aware of the room, of the wind, of the quiet movements of the house around her. The house itself had begun to settle again after the night's wind. There were small sounds, the shift of wood, the faint creak near the door-frame, the soft, almost imperceptible tapping of something loose outside. None of it troubled her. These were not interruptions, but confirmations. The house remained, the island remained, the sea with its endless repetitions remained. From where she stood, she could see the lighthouse at the far end of the island, though only faintly. It appeared and disappeared within the fog, its outline forming and dissolving in a way that made it seem less like a structure than a suggestion of one. It had not been in use for years, yet it continued to stand, its presence unchanged by its lack of function. She had walked there often in the early years, less so now, not for any clear reason, but because the path had become familiar in a way that no longer required repetition. It existed in her memory with enough detail that she could traverse it without moving, could recall the incline of the ground, the way the wind gathered at a particular bend, the slight hesitation required to step across a narrow break in the rock. She lifted the cup to her lips, took a small sip, and found that the coffee had gone cold. For a moment she considered going back inside to warm it again. Instead, she remained where she was. The fog shifted slightly, thinning just enough to reveal more of the shoreline. The rocks emerged in uneven lines, their surfaces dark with moisture, reflecting what little light the morning offered. Beyond them, the sea extended outward in a muted expanse, its movement steady but subdued, as though it too were waiting for something to clarify. Ellen drew in a slow breath. There were mornings when she felt that the island did not simply exist around her, but within her, that its quiet, its restraint, its refusal to fully reveal itself had become something she carried rather than something she observed. She did not find that unsettling. If anything, it felt accurate. She had come here 12 years earlier, though the number did not hold much meaning for her. Time in a place like this did not accumulate in the same way. It did not mark itself clearly. It did not insist on being counted. It passed, and she had passed with it. There were things she had left behind when she came. Not objects, those had been few enough, but something less tangible, something that had not required packing or decision. It had simply receded gradually until it no longer pressed against her in the way it once had, or perhaps it had not receded at all. Perhaps she had only learned to move in such a way that she did not encounter it. She shifted her weight slightly, the wood of the porch firm beneath her feet, and looked again toward the lighthouse. It was barely visible now. The fog had thickened again, drawing closer, closing the distance between what could be seen and what could not. She stood there for a while longer, the cup still in her hands, the morning continuing its slow, incomplete arrival. Nothing demanded her attention, nothing required her to act, and yet, beneath that stillness, there was something else, so faint that she might have missed it if she had not grown accustomed to listening for such things. A sense not of interruption, but of change, not immediate, not defined, but present. She did not yet know why. The house did not feel empty, though Ellen lived in it alone. It held instead a kind of quiet that suggested continuation rather than absence, as though the life that had once moved through it had not entirely withdrawn, but settled into the structure itself. There were places where this was more noticeable, corners where the air seemed slightly denser, a faint lingering scent in the wood during damp weather, the particular resistance of a drawer that opened only if lifted gently before being pulled. These were not inconveniences, they were instructions. Ellen had learned them slowly, not through effort, but through repetition, until they became part of her movement through the house, something she no longer consciously observed. She knew which floorboard would shift beneath her weight near the back wall, which window needed to be pushed twice before it would latch, how long the kettle took before it reached the point just before boiling, when the sound changed in a way that required attention. The house, in return, asked very little of her. It did not insist on change. It did not resist being left as it was. In that, it suited her. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a careful pressure that ensured the latch caught fully. The wind, though softened by the fog, still moved steadily across the island, and a door not properly secured would rattle in a way that unsettled the interior silence. She set the cup down on the table without finishing it. The coffee had cooled completely now, and she did not feel inclined to warm it again. There was no urgency to the morning, no requirement that it proceed in any particular direction. The table stood near the window, positioned so that in the afternoon a narrow band of light would fall across its surface. At this hour, however, it remained dim, the fog diffusing what little daylight had gathered. There were few objects on it, a folded cloth, a small ceramic bowl, and, near the centre, an envelope. Ellen paused. For a moment she did not approach it. She stood a few feet away, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her gaze fixed not directly on the envelope, but on the space just beside it, as though allowing her awareness to settle gradually rather than forcing it. She did not remember placing it there, but of course she had. She recalled now the door, the step, the act of bending, of picking it up. It had seemed at the time like a small interruption. It did not feel small now. She moved closer. The envelope lay exactly as she had left it, its surface unchanged, its presence somehow more defined within the room than it had been outside. It did not belong among the other objects. It did not align with them in age or purpose or familiarity. It was, in a quiet but unmistakable way, foreign, and yet she reached out and touched it. The paper was dry beneath her fingers, its texture slightly uneven, as though it had absorbed and released moisture many times over the years. It yielded just enough to pressure, not brittle but not new. Her name was written across the front, Ellen Margaret Harrow. She read it again, more slowly this time. Margaret. The name carried a faint distance, as though it belonged to someone she had once been, rather than someone she continued to be. It had not been used here, not by anyone on the island, not even by herself. There had been a time when it was spoken more often. She could not immediately place when that had ended. She turned the envelope over. There was no return address, no clear postmark, only a blurred impression in the corner, a faint discoloration that suggested something had once been stamped there, something that had since lost its clarity. She held it in both hands now. It was light, too light to contain more than a single sheet of paper. She felt, unexpectedly, a slight hesitation, not fear, something else, a recognition that whatever lay inside had already altered something, even before she had seen it. She placed the envelope back on the table, not abruptly, carefully, as though returning it to a position it had chosen for itself. Then she moved away from it. She went to the small counter near the stove, rinsed her cup, set it upside down to dry. The motions were familiar, practiced, requiring no thought, and yet her attention did not settle into them as it usually did. It remained divided, drawn back toward the table, toward the presence she had not yet acknowledged fully. After a moment, she stopped, stood still, listened. The house was quiet. The wind moved outside, its sound softened by the walls, but still present, still persistent. Somewhere, something shifted faintly, a loose hinge perhaps, or a branch brushing against the side of the house. Nothing unusual, nothing that required her, and yet she did not resume what she had been doing. Instead, she turned back toward the table. The envelope had not moved. Of course, it had not. But something about it had changed, not in its appearance, but in the way it occupied the space. It seemed now less like an object, and more like a point of convergence, something toward which her attention returned, regardless of her intention. She approached it again. This time she did not hesitate to pick it up. Her fingers traced the edges, the slight softness at the corners, the faint unevenness where the paper had been folded around what it contained. The handwriting. She studied it more closely now. There was something in it, something not entirely visible, but present in the formation of the letters, in the pressure of the lines, in the way certain strokes extended slightly further than necessary. A familiarity, not yet named, but there. She felt it then, not as a thought, but as a sensation, a subtle shift, as though something long held at a distance had moved, just slightly, closer. She did not open the envelope. Instead, she carried it to the chair near the window and sat down. The light, such as it was, fell faintly across her hands. She turned the envelope over once more, looked again at her name, and in the quiet space that followed, she became aware of something she had not felt in a long time. Not anticipation, not exactly, something quieter, something more uncertain, the sense that the past had not remained where she had left it, that it had in some way found its way back. She sat there for a long while, the envelope resting lightly in her hands, the house holding its silence around her, the sea continuing its steady, indifferent motion beyond the fog, and still she did not open it. The envelope remained unopened through the morning and then into the early afternoon, not because Ellen had decided against opening it, but because she found that the act itself resisted her in a way she could not immediately explain. It was not reluctance, nor was it fear. It was something more diffuse, something that existed in the space between intention and action, where thought had not yet resolved into movement. She placed the envelope on the table again, this time slightly closer to the edge, as though positioning it might alter her relation to it. Then she stepped away, moving toward the window with the quiet deliberateness that had come to define her days. Outside, the fog had thickened. The shoreline, which had been partially visible earlier, had withdrawn once more into suggestion. The rocks appeared only as darker interruptions in the grey, their outlines softened, their edges indistinct. The sea itself could not be seen clearly, but its presence remained constant, audible in the slow repeating rhythm of water against stone. Ellen stood there, her hands resting lightly on the window-sill, and allowed her gaze to move across what could not fully be seen. There was something familiar in this, the way the island withheld itself, the way it required patience, not effort. It did not offer clarity immediately. It did not yield to inspection. It existed in layers, and one moved through those layers not by forcing them apart, but by waiting for them to shift. She had learned this over time. Or perhaps she had come here because she already understood it. The thought passed through her without settling. Behind her, the envelope remained on the table. She did not turn to look at it, but she was aware of it in the same way one is aware of a presence in a room without needing to see it directly. It occupied a space not only in the room, but in her attention, drawing it back again and again without insistence. She moved away from the window, walked to the small cupboard near the sink, opened it, closed it again without taking anything out. The gesture felt incomplete, but she did not correct it. Instead, she stepped outside. The air had cooled slightly, though the fog held it close, preventing any clear sense of distance. Sound carried differently in this kind of weather, muted but more present, as though it lingered longer than usual before dissipating. Ellen walked down the narrow path that led from her house toward the shore. The ground was uneven in places, the rock exposed where the soil had worn away. She moved carefully, though she knew the path well enough that her steps required little attention. The familiarity of it allowed her to think without distraction, though she was not entirely aware of what she was thinking. Or perhaps she was not thinking at all. Perhaps she was waiting. She reached the edge of the rocks and stopped. The sea lay before her, though only partially visible. It moved in slow, deliberate patterns, the surface broken by small waves that gathered and collapsed without urgency. She stood there for a long time. The wind shifted slightly, pressing the fog in a new direction, thinning it just enough that the horizon suggested itself briefly before disappearing again. It occurred to her then, not as a realization, but as something that had been present for some time, that the envelope had altered the day, not dramatically, not in any way that could be easily described, but in the way her attention moved, in the way her thoughts, if they could be called that, circled something she had not yet approached directly. She became aware gradually of a question forming. Not a clear one, not yet, but something close to it. Who had written it? The answer seemed close, close enough that she could almost reach it, and yet she did not. Instead, she turned and began to walk back toward the house. Inside, the air felt slightly warmer, though she knew this was only relative. The house held the temperature differently than the outside, absorbing and releasing it in ways that did not follow any clear pattern. The envelope remained where she had left it. She stood near the table, looking at it again. This time she noticed something she had not before, the handwriting. Not just the familiarity of it, but its particular qualities, the way certain letters leaned slightly to the right, the pressure of the pen heavier at the beginning of each word, lighter toward the end, as though the writer had begun with certainty and finished with something more tentative. She leaned closer, traced the shape of the letters with her eyes, and then something shifted, not fully, not completely, but enough. A fragment of memory surfaced, not a scene, not a moment, just a sensation, a voice saying her name, not Ellen, but Ellen Margaret. She straightened. The sound of it, even in memory, carried something she hadn't expected, a familiarity that was not distant but immediate, as though it had not been recalled but recognized. She stepped back slightly. The envelope lay still on the table, unchanged, and yet it no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt known. She reached for it. This time her hand did not hesitate. Her fingers closed around the edges, feeling the slight give of the paper, the presence of what lay inside. She held it there for a moment, not opening it, but not setting it down. Her breath slowed. The house remained quiet. The sea continued its steady movement beyond the walls, and within that stillness the recognition settled more firmly into place. Daniel. She did not question it. She did not test it against anything else. The name aligned with the handwriting in a way that required no confirmation. Daniel Pierce. The past did not return all at once. It moved slowly, but it had begun. Ellen stood there, the envelope in her hand, the room unchanged around her, and understood, not fully, not yet, but with enough clarity to alter the moment, that whatever lay inside that letter did not belong only to what had been. It belonged to what remained. She looked down at it, her thumb resting lightly along the edge where it would open, and for the first time since finding it, she allowed herself to consider what it might contain, not in detail, not in certainty, but as a possibility, a message sent, a message delayed, a message that had somehow found its way to her now. She drew a slow breath, and still she did not open it. It was late afternoon before Ellen allowed herself to sit with the envelope without distraction. The light had shifted into that dim metallic grey that came when the sun existed only as a diffused presence behind the fog. The room held a quiet that felt thicker than usual, as though the air itself had settled into stillness. She drew the chair closer to the table and sat down. The envelope lay before her. She did not touch it immediately. Instead, she rested her hands on either side of it, palms down against the wood, as though steadying herself rather than the object between them. For a moment she closed her eyes, not to avoid it, but to allow something else to come forward without interruption. And it did. Not a full memory, not yet, but something that carried the weight of one. A voice, soft but not uncertain, saying her name in a way that altered it. Ellen Margaret. She opened her eyes. The sound lingered, not as something heard, but as something remembered with unusual clarity. It did not belong to the present. It did not belong to the island. It carried with it a different air, a different light, a different arrangement of time. She looked down at the envelope again. Her name, written the same way. She reached for it. This time her fingers did not pause at the edges. They moved with a quiet decisiveness, lifting it from the table, turning it slightly so that the fold lay upward. She held it there for a moment, and in that moment something within her shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that could be named, but with a subtle, irreversible movement, recognition, not just of the handwriting, of the person behind it, Daniel. The name settled fully now, no longer tentative, no longer uncertain. Daniel Pierce. She had not said it aloud in years. She did not say it now. There was no need. The memory did not arrive in a rush. It unfolded. The bookstore had been narrow. That was the first detail that returned with any clarity. Narrow and dimly lit, the shelves crowded in a way that made the space feel smaller than it was. There had been a faint smell, paper, dust, something slightly sweet beneath it, like adhesive or aging glue. She had been standing near the back, holding a book she had already decided not to buy. She remembered that clearly, the sense that the book itself was irrelevant, that she had picked it up more out of habit than interest, her attention elsewhere even then. Is that one worth finishing? The voice had come from behind her, not close, not distant. She had turned. He stood a few feet away, one hand resting lightly on the edge of a shelf, as though he had paused there rather than approached. "I don't know," she had said. "I haven't decided yet." He nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. "I always think I will," he said. "Finish them, I mean." There had been a brief pause. "But I don't." She remembered the way he said it, not with regret, but with a kind of quiet acceptance, as though the inconsistency did not trouble him. "That might be the better approach," she had replied. He had smiled then, not broadly, just enough to suggest that something had been understood. "I'm Daniel," he said. "Ellen." There had been no expectation in the exchange, no sense that anything had begun, and yet she remembered leaving the bookstore differently than she had entered it, not changed, not entirely, but aware of something. Ellen sat still, the envelope held lightly in her hands, the memory settling around her without pressing too hard. The room remained unchanged, the table, the chair, the faint light at the window, and yet the space felt altered, not by anything visible, but by the presence of something that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there all along. She turned the envelope over again, her thumb resting along the sealed edge. The paper gave slightly under pressure. She could open it now, easily. The act required nothing more than a small movement, a simple decision. And yet she did not. Instead, she placed it back on the table. Not with hesitation, with intention. She leaned back in the chair. Her gaze moved toward the window, though she did not focus on what lay beyond it. The fog had thickened again. The outside world had receded into suggestion. It struck her then, not as a sudden realization, but as something that had been forming gradually. That memory did not return in the way she had once believed. It did not come back intact. It did not restore what had been. It rearranged, it shifted, it revealed certain things while obscuring others, and what it revealed now was incomplete. The bookstore, the voice, the name, but not what followed. She closed her eyes again, allowed herself to remain there in that partial recollection, and after a moment something else began to surface, not a scene, a direction, a sense of movement, walking together, not planned, not decided, but happening. She opened her eyes. The envelope remained on the table, unopened, but no longer distant. It had become something else now, not an interruption, not an intrusion, but a continuation of something she had not yet fully remembered. Ellen sat there, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the fading light pressing softly against the window, and understood, not entirely, but enough, that whatever lay inside that letter would not simply tell her something she did not know. It would alter what she believed she already did, and that, more than anything, was why she had not yet opened it. The following morning arrived without distinction, though Ellen sensed, even before she opened her eyes, that something within her had shifted during the night. It was not a dream she remembered. There were no images that remained, no fragments of narrative to reconstruct, and yet the feeling persisted that something had been set in motion, something that would not easily return to where it had been. She lay still for a while, listening. The wind had quieted. The sea, though still present, seemed further away, its rhythm softened, as though the fog had drawn a heavier curtain between the house and the shore. The silence inside the room held differently now, not empty, but attentive. She sat up slowly. The light was faint, filtered through the same dense grey that had lingered for days. It entered the room without direction, flattening the edges of objects, softening their outlines. She dressed without turning on the lamp. There was no need. She moved through the house with the same quiet efficiency she had cultivated over the years, measuring coffee, filling the kettle, waiting for the subtle shift in sound that told her the water was ready. The envelope remained on the table. She saw it immediately, not because it drew her attention abruptly, but because her awareness had already adjusted to its presence. It no longer felt foreign in the room. It had settled there, as though it had always been part of the arrangement. She poured the coffee, sat down. The chair gave its usual soft creak beneath her weight. For a moment she simply looked at the envelope. Then, without deciding to do so, she reached for it. Her fingers moved along the edge, feeling again the slight unevenness of the paper, the faint resistance where it had been sealed. She turned it over slowly, as though the act itself required care. Daniel. The name did not arrive this time as recognition. It was already there. What followed, however, was something else, a continuation. They had begun to walk together without naming it. At first, it had been incidental, a coincidence of timing, then something more regular, not arranged in advance, but expected. She would find herself drawn toward the river in the late afternoon, not with intention, but with a quiet certainty that she would see him there. And she did. He was often already waiting, not in a way that suggested anticipation, but as though he had arrived before the moment itself had fully formed. "You're early," she said once. He looked at her, then at the water. "I didn't think I was," he replied. She smiled slightly. "You were." He considered this. "Then I suppose I was waiting." "For me?" He did not answer immediately. "For something," he said. They walked. The path followed the curve of the river, narrowing in places where the ground had eroded, widening again where the grass grew thicker. The trees leaned inward slightly, their branches filtering the light in uneven patterns that shifted as the day moved toward evening. They spoke, though not continuously. There were stretches of silence that did not require filling. She had not been accustomed to that. Silence in most conversations she had known carried expectation, an implicit pressure to continue, to explain, to maintain the movement of words. With Daniel it did not. It existed, and that was enough. "You don't stay anywhere very long, do you?" he asked one evening. The question came without emphasis, as though it had formed naturally from the rhythm of their walking. She considered it. "No," she said. Why not? She hesitated. The answer, if there was one, did not present itself clearly. I don't know, she said after a moment. I suppose I don't see the point. He glanced at her. In staying? In deciding, she said. He nodded slightly, as if it might limit something. She looked at him. Yes, she said, something like that. They walked a few more steps in silence. And does it? He asked. She frowned faintly. Does what? Not deciding, he said. Does it keep things open? She thought about it. I think it just delays them, she said. He smiled, but there was something in it that she did not fully understand at the time. Ellen sat at the table, the envelope still in her hands, the memory unfolding with a steadiness that felt both familiar and new. She could see it now more clearly, the path, the way the light moved through the trees, the quiet space between their words. But more than that, she could feel something she had not fully acknowledged then. A tension, not discomfort, something quieter. The sense that something was forming between them that required recognition, and that she had not recognized it, or had chosen not to. She turned the envelope again, her thumb resting along the seam. It would open easily. The paper had already begun to loosen at the edges. She could read it now, know what he had written, know what he had. She stopped. The thought did not complete itself. Instead, she placed the envelope back on the table. Her hand lingered on it for a moment, then withdrew. She lifted her cup, took a sip. The coffee had gone lukewarm again. She did not notice. Her gaze remained on the envelope, on the handwriting, on the name she had already recognized. Daniel. The memory had not finished. She could feel that. It had only begun to move into something more defined, more complete, and with that came something else, not yet fully formed, but present, a sense that what she had remembered for years was not entirely accurate. She did not resist that thought. She did not examine it. She allowed it to remain where it was, unresolved, for now. When she stood and moved toward the window, the fog had begun to thin again, though only slightly. The outline of the shoreline returned in faint layers, the rocks emerging one by one, the sea just visible beyond them. She rested her hand lightly against the glass. The surface was cool. Outside, the world remained unchanged. Inside, something had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. The envelope lay on the table behind her, unopened, and yet it no longer felt closed. By the afternoon the fog had begun to lift in uneven strands, drawing itself slowly away from the shoreline, as though reluctant to release what it had concealed. The sea appeared in fragments, first as a darker shift beneath the horizon, then as a surface, restless and continuous, its motion resuming its familiar clarity. Ellen stood by the window and watched it return. There was something about this gradual revealing that unsettled her more than complete obscurity ever had. When nothing could be seen, the mind did not strain toward definition. It accepted the limit. But when shapes began to emerge, partial, incomplete, the desire to understand them grew stronger. She turned away from the window. The envelope remained on the table. It had not changed, and yet everything around it had. She crossed the room and sat down again, this time without hesitation, her hands resting on the wood beside it, her gaze steady. The memory had not released her. It had deepened. There had been an evening, not distinct at first, but gradually separating itself from the others. The air had been warmer, the light slower to fade. They had walked further than usual, following the river beyond the point where the path narrowed and the ground became uneven. the grass giving way to patches of exposed earth and stone. "You don't mind this?" he asked, glancing down at the ground as they stepped over a shallow break in the path. "No," she said. "It's easier in a way." "Easier? Less defined," she said. "There's nothing to follow." He smiled faintly. "I thought that was the point of a path." She looked ahead. "Only if you're trying to get somewhere." He did not respond immediately. After a moment he said, "Aren't you?" She considered that. The question did not feel simple. "I'm not sure," she said. They walked a few steps in silence. Then he said, "I think you are." She turned to him slightly. "And you?" He hesitated. "Yes," he said, "but I don't always know where." Ellen could see it now with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. The way the light had settled along the river, the subtle shift in the air as evening approached, the quiet persistence of something unspoken between them. There had been a moment, not marked, not acknowledged, but present. They had stopped walking. She did not remember why. Perhaps the path had ended, or perhaps they had simply reached a point where continuing forward felt unnecessary. The river moved beside them, its surface catching what remained of the light, breaking it into uneven fragments. Daniel had been looking at the water. "You're leaving," he said. She hadn't answered immediately. The statement had not surprised her. "Yes," she said. "When?" "Soon." He nodded. "How soon?" "A few days." He exhaled, not sharply, but in a way that suggested something had shifted within him. "I thought you might," he said. She glanced at him. "Why?" He looked at her then. "Because you don't stay." The words were not accusatory. They were simply true. She felt something in her chest tighten slightly, though she did not immediately understand why. "That's not always a bad thing," she said. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." A pause. "But it can be," he added. She looked away, at the river, at the light that was beginning to fade. "How?" she asked. He did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "It depends on what you leave behind." Ellen sat very still. The envelope lay between her hands, though she was no longer aware of holding it. The memory had shifted. It was no longer distant. It had become something she was inside of again. She could feel it now, not just what had been said, but what had not. The space between his words, the way he had looked at her, not asking, not insisting, but waiting. She had not seen it then, or she had seen it and chosen not to interpret it. She was not certain which was more accurate. "What would make you stay?" he asked. The question had come unexpectedly. She had turned to him. "I don't know," she said. "That's not true," he said gently. She frowned slightly. "It might be." He shook his head. "No," he said. "You know." She hesitated. There was an answer. She could feel it, but it did not form into words. Instead, she said, "Why does it matter?" He held her gaze. "Because I'd like to know if it's possible." "For what?" she asked. "For you to stay?" he said. The air had changed then, not visibly, but in a way that altered everything that followed. Ellen drew a slow breath. The room returned around her, the table, the chair, the faint light at the window. The envelope lay where she had placed it, unopened, and yet it felt as though she had already begun to read it. She understood something now that she had not allowed herself to understand then. He had not been speaking in abstractions. He had not been asking out of curiosity. He had been offering something. Not directly, but clearly enough, and she She had not answered, not truly. She had remained where she always had, in that space between decision and delay, where nothing was chosen, and yet everything was determined. She lifted the envelope again. Her fingers pressed lightly against the sealed edge. This time she did not hesitate as long. But still, she did not open it. Instead, she held it there, aware now not only of what it contained, but of what it represented. Not just a message, but a moment, one she had not fully lived when it occurred, one that had remained incomplete until now. Outside, the fog continued to lift, revealing more of the sea, more of the rocks, more of the horizon. The island emerged again, piece by piece. Ellen sat at the table, the envelope in her hands, the past no longer distant but present, unfolding with a quiet inevitability. And for the first time since it had arrived, she understood. That opening, it would not simply reveal something new. It would confirm something she had once refused to see. That evening, the wind rose again. It did not arrive suddenly, but gathered itself over time, moving first in low currents along the ground, then lifting, pressing against the sides of the house with a steady insistence that carried through the walls in faint vibrations. The sound of it filled the spaces between other sounds, settling into the structure as though it had always belonged there. Ellen lit the lamp. The room shifted immediately, the dim grey of the afternoon giving way to a contained amber light that drew the objects within it closer together. Shadows formed along the edges of the walls, soft but defined, creating a sense of enclosure that the daylight had not offered. The envelope lay on the table within that circle of light. She had not moved it, she had not opened it, and yet, as the evening settled, she found that her relation to it had altered once again, not in distance, but in depth. It no longer felt like something external. It felt connected. She sat at the table with her hands folded loosely before her gaze resting not on the envelope itself, but on the surface of the wood just beside it. The wind pressed harder now. A faint rattling began near the window, a subtle vibration where the frame met the glass. She listened, not to the wind alone, but to what it carried, the sense of something unsettled, something moving without resolution. It was a familiar feeling, not from the island, from before. There had been another evening, not the same one, but close to it. The air had been cooler that day, the warmth of summer beginning to give way to something less certain. The light had faded more quickly, leaving the path along the river in a kind of suspended dimness where shapes were still visible, but without sharpness. They had walked more slowly, not because the ground required it, but because something in their movement had changed. "You'll go back," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied. "When?" "Soon." The word felt insufficient, but she did not correct it. He nodded, though she could see that he was not satisfied with the answer. "Soon," he repeated. "Yes." They walked a few steps in silence. Then he stopped. She stopped as well, though she had not intended to. "Why?" he asked. The question came quietly, not demanding, but direct. She turned to him. "I told you," she said. "There's nothing for me here." He held her gaze. "That's not true." She felt a slight irritation at that, not sharp, but enough to register. "You don't get to decide that," she said. "I'm not deciding," he replied. "I'm asking you to look at it differently." She shook her head. "I'm looking at it." "No," he said. "You're avoiding it." The words settled between them. She felt something tighten in her chest. "I'm not avoiding anything," she said. He did not respond immediately. When he did, His voice was softer. Then stay. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than anything else he had said. It left no space for interpretation, no room to move around it, just stay. Ellen shifted slightly in her chair. The memory had become clearer now, more defined than it had been before. It no longer existed in fragments. It held together, its edges firm, its progression undeniable. She could see him, the way he had stood, the way he had looked at her, not expectant, not pleading, but open, waiting. She had not understood that then, or she had understood it and chosen not to engage with it fully. The distinction remained unclear. "I can't," she had said. The words had come quickly, too quickly. He had noticed. Why not? She hesitated. The answer she had given did not satisfy her even as she spoke it. "It's not what I do," she said. He frowned slightly. "What you do?" "I don't stay," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "And you think that's fixed?" he asked. She did not answer. Because she did not know, or because she did not want to know. Ellen drew in a slow breath. The room felt smaller now, though nothing in it had changed. The envelope lay within reach. The lamp cast its steady light. The wind continued its quiet insistence against the walls. She became aware, with increasing clarity, that what she had carried for years as a simple memory, something that had happened, something that had ended, was not simple at all. It had been active, a moment that had required something from her, a response, a decision, and she had not made one, or she had made one through absence. "What if you did?" he had asked. The question lingered. What if you stayed? She had looked at him then, truly looked, and in that moment something had almost formed, something that might have altered everything that followed, but it had not. Instead, she had said, "I wouldn't know what to do." The answer had been honest, but incomplete. He had nodded, not in agreement, in understanding. And that, somehow, had been worse. Ellen reached for the envelope. Her fingers closed around it more firmly this time. She felt the slight resistance of the paper, the presence of the letter inside. Her thumb moved along the edge. It would open easily. The seal had already begun to loosen. She held it there. The memory had not finished. There was more. She could feel it. Something beyond this. Something that had followed. Something she had not yet allowed herself to see clearly. Outside, the wind shifted direction, pressing more strongly against the far side of the house. The sound changed, deeper now, more sustained. Inside, the lamp burned steadily. Ellen sat at the table, the envelope in her hands, the past unfolding with a quiet, persistent force, and for the first time she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Not regret, not fully, but something close to it, a recognition that what she had once believed to be inevitable had not been. She placed the envelope back on the table, not because she was finished with it, but because she understood now that opening it would not be the beginning. It would be confirmation, and she was not yet ready to confirm what she had only just begun to see. The wind quieted sometime during the night, though Ellen did not hear it happen. She woke into a stillness that felt unfamiliar, as though something that had been pressing against the house for days had withdrawn without leaving a trace of its departure. The silence was not complete. The sea remained, distant but present, but it no longer carried the same weight. For a moment she lay still, aware of the absence. Then she sat up. The light had shifted. The fog had thinned enough that the outline of the window appeared sharper, the edges of objects within the room more defined. It was not clarity exactly, but something closer to it than she had seen in days. She dressed slowly. There was no urgency in her movements, but neither was there the same distance that had marked the previous days. Something had narrowed, something had begun to take shape. When she entered the main room, her gaze went immediately to the table. The envelope lay where she had left it, unchanged, and yet it no longer felt like a question. It felt like an answer she had not yet read. She poured coffee, though she barely tasted it, and sat down. This time she did not hesitate to touch the envelope. Her fingers rested on it, not lightly, but with a steadiness that suggested she no longer expected it to disappear. The memory returned without effort. There had been a day when the air felt suspended, not warm, not cold, something in between. The kind of day that did not commit itself fully to any direction, that held itself in a state of quiet possibility. They had not walked to the river that day. Instead, they had remained in town. A small cafe, nearly empty, the sound of a radio playing softly from somewhere behind the counter. They sat across from each other. The space between them felt different, more defined. "You're thinking about leaving," he said. She looked up. "I told you I was." "That's not the same thing," he replied. She held his gaze. "What's the difference?" He leaned back slightly, considering. "One is something you say," he said. "The other is something you've already decided." She felt something shift. "I haven't decided," she said. He studied her for a moment. "No," he said quietly, "you just haven't admitted it." She looked away. The window beside them reflected a faint image of the street. Movement, indistinct figures passing, a world continuing without reference to them. "I don't think that's fair," she said. "I'm not trying to be fair," he replied. There was no sharpness in his voice, only a kind of clarity that unsettled her more than accusation would have. "I'm trying to understand you," he said. She turned back to him. Why? The question surprised her as soon as she asked it, but she did not take it back. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her in a way she had not seen before, not searching, not uncertain, but steady. "Because you matter to me," he said. The words did not arrive with emphasis. They did not need to. She felt them settle into the space between them, altering it in a way that could not be reversed. She did not respond, not because she did not hear them, but because she did not yet know how to hold them. Ellen sat very still. Her hand remained on the envelope, though her attention had moved entirely into the memory. She could feel it now, not just what had been said, but the weight of it, the way it had shifted everything that followed. She had known, in that moment, she had understood, and yet she had not acted on it. "You don't have to understand me," she had said finally. The words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. "I know," he said. "Then why—" "Because I want to," he said. She looked at him. There was something in his expression she had not fully recognized then, something that required more than observation, something that required response. "You shouldn't," she said. He smiled slightly, though there was no amusement in it. "That's not really your decision," he said. She felt a flicker of frustration. "Then whose is it?" "Mine," he said simply. The answer left no room for argument. She sat back. The chair creaked softly beneath her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Stay." The word was quiet, but it held. Ellen closed her eyes briefly. The memory pressed closer now, no longer distant, no longer softened by time. She could feel the moment as it had been. the pause, the weight of what had been asked, the awareness that something had reached a point where it could no longer remain undefined. She opened her eyes. The envelope lay beneath her hand, still closed, still waiting, but no longer separate from what she remembered. "I can't," she had said. Again, the same words, the same refusal, but now she could hear them differently, not as a statement of fact, but as a retreat. "Why?" he asked. She hesitated. There had been an answer. She knew that now, but she had not given it. Instead, she had said, "I just can't." He had looked at her then, not with disappointment, not with anger, but with something quieter, understanding, and something else, something she had not named. Ellen drew a slow breath. The room returned around her. The table, the chair, the faint light at the window, the envelope. She realized then, with a clarity that felt both sudden and inevitable, that she had not misremembered what had happened. She had simplified it, reduced it to something easier to carry. He had left, that was true, but he had not left without offering her the possibility of something else. And she had not taken it. Her fingers moved along the edge of the envelope again. The seal was fragile now, ready to give way. She could open it, read what he had written, see how he had understood it himself. She held it there for a moment longer, not resisting, but waiting, because she knew now there was still one more memory, one she had not yet faced fully, the last one, the one that had followed all the others, the one that had fixed everything in place. She released the envelope, set it down, stood, moved toward the window. Outside, the fog had lifted further. The shoreline was clearer now, the rocks sharp against the water, the sea moving in steady, deliberate waves. The lighthouse visible again in the distance, unchanged, waiting. Ellen rested her hand against the glass, her reflection faintly visible, older now, but still herself, and behind her, on the table, the envelope remained. No longer distant, no longer unknown, but not yet opened. By late afternoon, the light had sharpened enough that the edges of things no longer dissolved into one another. The fog had not lifted entirely, but it had retreated, leaving behind a clarity that felt provisional, as though it might withdraw again without warning. Ellen left the house without deciding to. The envelope remained on the table. She did not take it with her. It did not feel necessary. What it contained had already begun to unfold. The path to the lighthouse was uneven, the ground shifting beneath her feet in ways that required attention, but not thought. She had walked it many times before, though not recently, and as she moved along it now, she found that her body remembered what her mind did not. The slight incline near the beginning, the narrow stretch where the rock pressed close, the place where the wind gathered more forcefully, turning the air colder. The sea lay to her right, more visible now, its surface restless, broken into small, insistent movements that seemed to carry an urgency she could not fully name. She walked steadily, not quickly, not slowly, just forward. The station had been louder than she had expected. That was the first thing she remembered clearly. Not overwhelming, but constant. The sound of footsteps on concrete, voices overlapping, indistinct. The distant metallic echo of a train approaching or departing. It was difficult to tell which. She had stood beside him, a small distance between them, not deliberate, but present. "You have everything?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." Her bag rested at her feet. Light. She had not brought much. He looked down at it briefly. "That's all?" "It's enough," she said. He nodded. Of course it was. For her, it always was. Ellen reached the base of the lighthouse and stopped. The structure rose above her, its surface weathered, marked by years of exposure, its paint worn in places where the wind and salt had taken their time. She did not go inside. Instead, she stood there, looking out toward the sea. The memory continued. "You're right?" she asked. The question felt necessary, expected. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. A pause. "And you?" he asked. She hesitated just for a moment, but he saw it. "Yes," she said. The words settled between them, not firmly, but not entirely uncertain either. Another pause, longer this time. He did not look away. She could feel it, that he was waiting, not for the words she had already spoken, for something else, something more. She knew it. She understood it, even then, and yet she did not move toward it. Ellen shifted her weight slightly on the uneven ground. The wind had begun to rise again, though not as strongly as before. It moved in measured currents, brushing against her coat, lifting the edge of her sleeve. She did not turn away from the sea. "You could stay," he said. The words were quiet, almost lost in the movement of the air, but she heard them clearly. She turned to him. He was not looking at her directly now. His gaze had shifted slightly, as though he were allowing her space to respond without pressure. "I told you," she said. The words came automatically. "I can't." He nodded. "Yes," he said. A brief pause. "You've said that." She felt something in her chest tighten. There was a difference in his voice now, not in tone, in certainty, as though something had settled for him that had not yet settled for her. The announcement came over the station, a voice, distant, distorted, naming something she did not fully hear. The train? It was arriving, or it was about to. The distinction blurred. "You could still," he said, not insisting, not urging, just stating. The possibility remained. She looked at him, truly looked, and in that moment everything aligned, not gradually, not uncertainly, but with a clarity she had not allowed herself before. She saw what he was offering. She saw what it required, and she saw what it would mean to accept it, to stay, to remain, to choose something that did not allow for retreat. Ellen closed her eyes briefly. The wind moved past her. The sound of the sea continued. The lighthouse stood behind her, silent. "I can't," she said again, but this time she heard it, not as truth, as refusal. He nodded, once, not in agreement, in acceptance. "All right," he said. The words were simple, final. He did not ask again. The train entered the station. The sound of it filled the space, louder now, more immediate, the movement undeniable. People shifted around them, stepped forward, stepped back. The moment narrowed. "All right," he said. She nodded. "Yes." But something had already changed. She could feel it, even then. Ellen opened her eyes. The present returned. The sea stretched before her. The light had begun to fade again, though more slowly this time. She stood there, the memory no longer incomplete, not fully, but enough. She understood now what she had not allowed herself to understand before. The moment had not been taken from her. It had been offered, and she had declined it. Not with certainty, but with silence. She turned back toward the house. The path lay before her, familiar, unchanged, and yet different, because she was no longer moving through it without knowing what she had left behind. The envelope waited on the table. She could feel it even before she saw it again. Not as an object, as a continuation, and this time she knew she would open it. By the time Ellen returned to the house, the light had thinned into evening, though it had not yet darkened. The sky held a muted, colourless glow, and the sea, what could be seen of it through the shifting fog, moved with a subdued persistence that seemed almost deliberate. She closed the door behind her carefully. The house received her without change, the same quiet, the same arrangement of objects, and yet, as she stepped further inside, she felt something unmistakable, an alteration not in the space itself, but in her relation to it. The room no longer held her in the same way. It did not contain her thoughts as it had before. They moved now with a different kind of direction, gathering towards something she could no longer avoid. The envelope lay on the table. She stopped a few steps away from it. For a moment she simply stood there, her hands at her sides, her gaze fixed on it without softness, without distance. It no longer felt like something separate from her. It had become inevitable. She moved closer, pulled the chair out, sat. The wood creaked beneath her, a familiar sound that did nothing to anchor her now. Her hands rested on the table. Then, slowly, she reached forward and took the envelope. The paper felt the same, dry, slightly softened at the edges. But her hand did not hesitate this time. Her thumb slid beneath the flap, paused, not from uncertainty, from recognition. This was the moment she had delayed, not because she did not want to know, but because she had begun to understand what knowing would require. She opened it. The paper inside unfolded with a faint resistance, as though it had remained closed for a very long time, and was reluctant to give way. She held it carefully, smoothed it against the table. The handwriting was the same, unmistakable now. Daniel. She began to read. Ellen, I have tried to write this several times already, and each time I find that what I mean does not arrive in the way I expect it to. Perhaps that is the problem, not the words, but the expectation that they will hold what I have not been able to say. She paused. Her breath remained steady, but something within her had tightened, not sharply, but with a quiet, persistent pressure. She continued. There is a moment when something becomes clear, not because it has changed, but because we have stopped avoiding it. I think I reached that moment the day you told me you were leaving. Ellen's fingers pressed slightly into the edge of the paper. The memory was already there. The river, the conversation, the refusal. But here in his words it took on a different shape. Not something that had passed, but something that had been recognized. I don't know if you saw it the same way. I don't know if you saw it at all. That's not meant as a criticism. I think there are things you choose not to see until they become impossible to ignore. She leaned back slightly. The chair shifted beneath her. The room seemed quieter now, as though even the small, constant sounds had withdrawn. I wanted to say something then, more than I did, but I kept thinking there would be another moment, that it didn't have to happen all at once. Ellen closed her eyes briefly. There had been other moments, many, but none of them had held. I see now that I was wrong about that. The words settled, firm, without emphasis. She looked down at the page again. Her hand remained steady, but she was aware of something else, something beneath the surface of her attention, moving slowly into clarity. He had known, not everything, not completely, but enough. You said you couldn't stay. I believed you. But I also think you never asked yourself what would happen if you did. Ellen inhaled slowly. The air felt different now, thinner, more precise. The memory shifted again, not in content, but in emphasis. She had remembered what she said. She had not remembered what she had not considered. I did not ask you again. That was my decision. I told myself that if it mattered, you would say something. Her grip tightened slightly on the paper. You didn't. The sentence stood alone. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply remained. Ellen lowered the letter slightly, looked at the table, at the faint marks in the wood, the subtle variations in colour where time had altered the surface. She felt something move within her, not sharply, but undeniably. She had believed for years that the ending had been shaped by circumstances, that it had unfolded in a way that left no alternative, that what had happened was inevitable. But here, in his words, there was no inevitability. There was only absence. She lifted the letter again. There was more. She had not reached the end. The wind brushed faintly against the house. The sound returned, soft, persistent. The sea moved beyond the walls, unchanged, and yet everything within her had begun to shift. She read on. Ellen did not realize how long she had been sitting there until the light at the window shifted again, dimming almost imperceptibly, as though the day itself had withdrawn slightly while she was not looking. The letter remained open before her. Her eyes had paused on the last line, "You didn't," but her attention had moved elsewhere, into the space that followed it, into the silence that the words had left behind. She had not expected this, not the content exactly, but the tone, the absence of accusation, the absence of explanation. There was no attempt in what he had written to shape what had happened into something more acceptable, more understandable. He had not softened it. He had not clarified it. He had simply left it, and in doing so, he had removed the possibility of misreading. She lowered her gaze again, continued reading. "I'm not writing this to tell you that you should have stayed. I don't know if that would have been the right thing. I don't know if there is a right thing in the way we like to believe there is." Ellen felt her shoulders relax slightly, though she had not been aware of their tension. "But I do know this. I was not leaving in the way you thought I was." She stopped, read the line again, slowly. The words did not shift. They did not allow for reinterpretation. The station, the train, the sound of departure. She had remembered it clearly, or she had believed she had. He had been leaving. That had been the fact that held everything together. The fixed point, but now that point moved. She continued, "I told you it might be temporary. I meant that. I thought I would go and then come back." Her breath caught, though she did not move. The memory fractured slightly, not breaking apart, but loosening, as though the structure she had placed around it had begun to dissolve. She had not held on to that part, or she had chosen not to. I didn't say that clearly enough. That's on me. But I thought you understood something of it. Ellen leaned back slowly. The chair creaked. The room felt narrower now, the space between objects more defined, as though everything had drawn inward. Had she understood? The question did not settle. It moved through her, unsettling other things as it passed. She tried to recall, not the general sense of the moment, the details, the exact words, the tone, the pauses. "I told you it would be temporary." Had he said that? She searched for it, found only fragments, not certainty. Memory, she realized, had not preserved the moment. It had shaped it, reduced it, arranged it in a way that allowed her to live with it. She looked down at the letter again. I kept thinking that if you knew I would come back, you might ask me to stay anyway, or ask me to come back sooner, or say something that made it clear that what we had mattered in a way that could not be postponed. Ellen felt a slow, steady pressure build in her chest. What we had. The phrase lingered. She had not named it then, not fully. She had allowed it to exist without definition, without acknowledgement, and in doing so, she had diminished it or avoided it. You didn't do that. The repetition of it, not harsh, not insistent, but final. She closed her eyes. The station returned, not as a distant memory now, but as something immediate. The sound, the movement, his presence beside her, the space between them. She tried to see it differently, to adjust it, to align it with what he had written, but the two did not match easily. Her memory resisted, or perhaps it revealed something she had not allowed herself to see. She had not asked, not clearly, not directly. She had remained where she always had been, in that space where nothing was said that could not be undone. She opened her eyes. The letter lay before her, unchanged, but no longer separate from her own understanding. She continued reading. I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if it matters if it does, but I realized after I left that I had been waiting for something from you that you were never going to give. The words did not wound. They settled heavily. That's not a judgment. It's just something I didn't understand at the time. Ellen drew a slow breath. The room felt still again, but not in the same way. This stillness held something else, something that did not allow her to remain unchanged within it. She lowered the letter, rested her hand on the table. Her fingers pressed lightly against the wood, grounding herself, or attempting to. For years she had believed that what had happened between them had ended because it had to, because it could not have been otherwise, because circumstances had moved them in different directions. And she had accepted that, lived within it, built her life around that understanding. But now, that structure had shifted, not entirely, but enough. It had not been necessity. It had been something else, something quieter, less visible but no less decisive. Her silence, her refusal to step forward, her decision not to decide. She looked at the letter again. There was still more. She had not reached the end. Outside, the light dimmed further. The sea continued its steady movement. The lighthouse stood in the distance, barely visible now, its outline softened once again by the returning fog. Ellen sat at the table, the letter before her, the past no longer stable, no longer fixed in the way she had believed, and for the first time she understood that what unsettled her was not what he had written, but what it revealed. The room had grown darker without Ellen noticing the exact moment when the light began to fail. It was not an abrupt change. The edges of things had softened first, then receded until the table, the chair, the walls themselves seemed to exist less as defined forms and more as quiet presences within the dimness. The lamp remained unlit. She had not thought to turn it on. The letter lay open before her. She had not moved it. She had not folded it. She had not, for some time now, looked directly at the words. And yet she remained there, seated at the table, her hands resting lightly on the surface as though holding herself in place. The silence in the house had altered. It was no longer simply the absence of sound. It carried something, not pressure, not quite, something closer to expectation. Ellen drew a slow breath and lifted the letter again. The paper felt thinner now, as though it had lost substance simply by being read. Her fingers moved carefully along its edge, not out of caution, but because the act itself seemed to require a different kind of attention. She lowered her gaze and continued. I stayed longer than I said I would. At first, that was because of work. Then it was because I wasn't sure what I was coming back to. She paused. The words did not accuse. They did not demand. They simply extended the line of thought that had already begun. I thought about writing to you sooner. I tried to, more than once, but I found that I didn't know what I was writing into. Ellen's fingers tightened slightly on the page. What I was writing into. The phrase settled uneasily. She understood it immediately. Not intellectually, instinctively. There had been a space between them, not defined, not named, but present, and she had left it that way. I didn't know if you expected anything from me. I didn't know if what had happened between us meant something that continued, or something that had already ended. Ellen closed her eyes. The words moved through her with a clarity that left little room for resistance. She had believed for years that what had existed between them had simply stopped, that it had not required definition, that its absence of resolution had been natural. But now that absence appeared differently, not neutral, not inevitable, but created. I think now that I was waiting for a kind of certainty that you were never going to give me, and I didn't know how to move forward without it. She opened her eyes. The room felt smaller still, the darkness pressing closer. Though she knew this was only the fading of the light, she reached for the lamp, stopped. Her hand hovered there for a moment, then withdrew. She did not want the light. Not yet. She read on. So I stayed where I was, longer than I intended, long enough that coming back no longer felt like returning. The sentence settled into her slowly. That was the moment. She could feel it, the point at which something had shifted beyond recovery, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality. He had not decided not to come back. He had drifted away because nothing had drawn him back. Ellen lowered the letter. Her hand remained on it, her fingers pressing lightly into the paper, as though grounding herself in something tangible. She became aware of her breathing, slow, measured, but not entirely steady. She had always believed that his absence had been a decision, that he had chosen to go and not return, that he had left, but now that understanding no longer held. He had waited for something from her, something she had not given. She lifted the letter again. There were only a few lines left. She could feel it, the end approaching, not just of the letter, of something else, something that had extended far beyond it. I don't know if this is something you would have wanted. I don't know if staying would have changed anything in the way I imagined it might, but I do know that I never stopped thinking that there had been a moment where something else was possible. Ellen's breath caught slightly. The moment. She saw it now. Not just the station, not just the conversation, but the accumulation of all the moments before it, the walks, the pauses, the things left unsaid. They had not led to that moment. They had been that moment, extended, delayed, avoided. I think you felt it too. I think you chose not to act on it. She did not move. The words did not accuse, but they did not allow for denial. She had felt it. She knew that now. She had known it then, and she had stepped back from it. She lowered the letter slowly, rested it on the table. Her hands remained there, one on either side of it, as though it occupied a space that required acknowledgment. For a long time she did not think. She did not attempt to reconcile what she had read with what she had believed. She did not try to reshape the memory into something more manageable. She simply sat with it. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, though gently this time, moving along the walls of the house with a soft, persistent sound. The sea answered it in kind, steady, unchanged. The lighthouse stood somewhere beyond the fog, invisible now, but present. Ellen became aware slowly of something she hadn't yet allowed herself to feel. Not regret, not fully, something quieter, more difficult to name, recognition, not of what had happened, but of what had not. And in that recognition, something within her shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that altered the ground beneath everything she had believed about that part of her life. The letter lay before her. Only a few lines remained unread. She knew this. She could feel it. And yet she did not reach for it immediately, because she understood now that whatever remained would not change what she already knew. It would only name it. Ellen did not move for a long time. The letter remained on the table, its final lines waiting, though she no longer felt the urgency that had accompanied the beginning. What needed to be understood had already begun to settle within her, not as clarity, but as something more difficult to resist. The room had darkened completely now. Only the faintest trace of light remained at the window, a diluted grey that did not illuminate so much as suggest the presence of the outside world. The rest of the house had withdrawn into shadow. At last she reached for the lamp. The small click of the switch sounded louder than it should have. The light came slowly, spreading outward in a muted circle, revealing the table, the chair, the letter, everything returning to visibility without fully dispelling the darkness beyond. She looked down. The final lines remained. She drew a breath and read, "I loved you, Ellen." The words did not surprise her, and yet they did not pass through her easily. They remained, simple, unqualified. "I think you knew that." Her eyes lingered there. She had known, not in the way one names something, but in the way one feels it and chooses not to define it. And I think I knew something about you too, that you would not stay, not because you didn't feel anything, but because feeling something was never enough for you to act on it. Ellen felt a slight tightening in her chest. Not sharp, but steady. "I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it can be changed." The words moved through her slowly. They did not accuse. They did not attempt to explain. They simply acknowledged something she had never fully named. "I think, for a long time, I believed that if I waited, you would reach that point on your own, that you would see what was there and choose it. But I understand now that waiting was my way of avoiding something too." She shifted slightly in her chair. The wood creaked beneath her. The room felt still again. "I could have asked you directly. I could have said more. I could have stayed and made it harder for you to leave." The sentence lingered. He could have. She had not allowed herself to consider that. "But I didn't, because I thought that if it mattered, you would come toward it without being pushed." Ellen lowered her gaze for a moment. The words settled into her with a quiet weight. Maybe that wasn't fair. The admission was small, but it changed something. Maybe I expected something from you that you weren't able to give. She exhaled slowly. But I also think this is true. She felt it before she read it, the final movement, the place where everything would gather. If you had asked me to stay, I would have. The sentence did not need emphasis. It did not need explanation. It stood, complete. Ellen closed her eyes. The moment returned, not as memory, but as presence, the station, the noise, the space between them, the question that had not been asked, the words that had not been spoken. She saw it now, not as it had been softened over time, but as it had existed, open, unresolved, waiting, and she had said nothing. She opened her eyes. The letter remained in her hands, the room unchanged, the light steady. I don't know if this will reach you, and I don't know what it would mean if it did. The words felt distant now, not unimportant, but no longer central. I hope you're somewhere that feels like a choice. She read the line again, slowly, not just something that happened. Ellen felt something shift, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision. That's all I wanted for you. The letter ended there. No signature, no closing, nothing that softened what had been said. She remained seated, the paper still open in her hands. The room held its silence. The wind moved faintly outside. The sea continued. For a long time she did not move. She did not attempt to reinterpret what she had read. She did not search for something she might have missed. There was nothing hidden, nothing ambiguous, only what had been and what had not. She placed the letter on the table. Her hand remained on it for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the paper, as though acknowledging its presence in a way she had not before. For years she had believed that the past had settled into something fixed, that it had reached its conclusion, that it had become something she could carry without examining. But now, that certainty had shifted. Not everything had been decided. Not everything had been inevitable. There had been a moment, and she had stepped away from it. Ellen sat there, the letter before her, the light steady, the room unchanged, and within that stillness she felt something she had not expected. Not regret, not entirely, but something quieter, something that did not press, something that did not accuse, an understanding that what she had lost had not been taken. It had been left. The night settled without announcement. Ellen did not notice when the last trace of daylight disappeared from the window, nor when the room became fully contained within the soft circle of the lamp. The transition was gradual, almost imperceptible, and by the time it had completed itself, there was no clear sense of what had changed, only the quiet awareness that it had. She remained at the table. The letter lay before her, no longer held, no longer in motion. It had returned to being an object again. Paper, ink, the faint marks of time along its edges. And yet it did not feel diminished by that return. If anything, it felt more settled, as though it had fulfilled its purpose simply by being read. She did not reach for it again. There was nothing more to take from it. What it had brought had already entered her. After some time she stood. The movement was slow, not from reluctance, but from the simple awareness of her body in space, of the chair beneath her, the floor beneath her feet, the quiet weight of the room around her. She crossed to the window. Outside, the island had withdrawn almost completely into darkness. The fog, which had thinned during the day, had returned, pressing close once more, erasing the horizon, softening even the nearest shapes. The sea could not be seen, but it could be heard. Its rhythm remained unchanged, steady, patient, indifferent to what had shifted within her. She rested her hand lightly against the glass. It was cool. The temperature of it grounded her in a way that thought no longer did. For a long time she stood there, not thinking, not searching, simply aware. The past did not return to her again in that moment. It did not need to. It had already settled into a form that no longer required reconstruction. What had been unclear had become visible, not entirely, not in every detail, but enough to understand. She had not been forced into her life. She had not been carried by circumstance into the shape it had taken. She had moved within it, quietly, without resistance, without decision, and that had been a kind of decision. Ellen did not feel the sharp edge of regret she might once have expected. There was no sudden desire to return, no imagined version of the past in which things had unfolded differently. That path did not open itself now. It remained where it had always been, untaken, but something else had changed. The distance she had maintained from that part of her life, the way she had held it at a remove, simplified it, allowed it to settle into something manageable. That distance had shifted, not collapsed, but softened. She could see it now more clearly, not as a single moment, but as a series of moments, each one carrying within it the possibility of something else, each one left as it was. She turned from the window. The room appeared smaller now, though nothing had changed. The table, the chair, the letter, all as they had been. And yet she moved through the space differently. She returned to the table, looked at the letter, then reached for it, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but simply because it was there. She folded it carefully, along the same lines where it had been creased before. Her fingers moved with a quiet precision, smoothing the paper, aligning the edges. The act required attention, and she gave it. For a moment she held it in her hands, not reading, not searching, just holding. Then she turned, moved to the shelf above the desk, reached for the small wooden box. She paused before opening it, her hand resting lightly on the lid. It had remained closed for years, not because she had forgotten it, but because she had not needed what it contained, or believed she had not. She lifted the lid. Inside, the contents were arranged as she had left them. A few letters, older than the one she now held. A photograph, its surface slightly worn at the edges. A small object she did not touch. She looked at them, not closely, just enough to acknowledge that they remained, that they had always remained. She placed Daniel's letter inside, not at the bottom, not hidden, but among the others. Then she closed the lid. The sound was soft, final, but not in a way that suggested ending. She stood there for a moment, her hand still resting lightly on the box. The past had not been resolved, not entirely. It had not been corrected. It had not been undone, but it had been seen. And that, she realized, was different. She turned away, moved back toward the center of the room. The lamp still cast its steady light. The shadows remained. The house held its quiet. Outside, the sea continued. The fog shifted. The lighthouse stood somewhere beyond it, unseen but present. Ellen stood in the middle of the room for a moment longer. Then she extinguished the lamp. Darkness returned, not abruptly, but fully, and within it she felt something she had not expected. Not closure, not peace, but a steadiness. Morning returned without urgency. The fog had not lifted entirely, but it had thinned enough that the outline of the shoreline appeared almost immediately, as though the island had decided for once not to conceal itself completely. The rocks stood in dark, uneven lines, their surfaces damp and reflective. Beyond them, the sea stretched outward in a muted expanse, its movements steady, unchanged. Ellen stood on the porch. The air was cooler than the day before, carrying a sharper edge that suggested the slow turning of the season. The wind had not yet risen, though it lingered somewhere beyond the stillness, waiting, as it often did, to reassert itself. She held no cup this morning. Her hands rested lightly at her sides. There was nothing she needed to bring with her into the day. She watched the water for a long time, not looking for anything in particular, not measuring the distance, just watching. The events of the previous day did not return to her in the same way they had unfolded. They did not press forward. They did not demand attention. They remained where they had settled, within her, not absent, but no longer insistent. She became aware gradually of the sounds around her, the faint call of a gull, distant and brief, the subtle shift of water as it moved against the rocks, the quiet, almost imperceptible movement of air along the edge of the house. Each sound existed on its own. None required interpretation. She stepped down from the porch. The ground beneath her feet was firm, the path familiar. She did not think about where she was going. She did not need to. Her body moved in the direction it had taken many times before, toward the shore. The rocks were damp from the night. She moved carefully, though without hesitation, stepping where she knew the surface would hold, where it would not give way beneath her weight. She reached the edge, stopped. The sea lay before her, its surface broken into small, continuous movements that reflected the pale light of the morning. It had not changed. It would not. Ellen stood there, her gaze resting on the water, and felt the quiet alignment of something within her, not a resolution, not an answer, but a kind of balance that had not been present before. The past had not been corrected, it had not been rewritten, but it had been re-seen. For years she had carried it as something closed, something finished, something that had happened and could not be altered. And that had been true, but incomplete. Now it existed differently, not as a fixed point, but as a series of moments, each one containing something she had not fully acknowledged, each one alive in a way she had not allowed. She did not feel the need to return to it, to revisit it again and again. It did not pull at her. It did not ask anything of her. It simply existed. The wind began to rise slightly, moving across the surface of the water, altering its texture, breaking the light into smaller, shifting fragments. Ellen watched as the pattern changed, as the surface reformed itself, again and again, without pause. She thought briefly of the letter, not of its words, but of its presence, of the way it had arrived, of the way it had waited, of the way it had remained unopened until she had been ready to see what it contained. It had not changed what had happened. It had not restored anything that had been lost, but it had altered how she held it. She drew a slow breath. The air was cool, clean, carrying the faint, familiar scent of salt. Somewhere beyond the fog, the lighthouse stood. She could not see it clearly now, but she knew where it was. She did not need to look. There had been a time when she had walked there often, when she had needed its presence, its height, its distance from the rest of the island. Now she did not feel that need in the same way. It remained, but it did not call to her. She remained where she was, at the edge of the rocks, the sea before her, the island behind her. For a moment she allowed herself to consider, not in detail, not in longing, but simply as a thought, what it might have been like to stay, to choose differently, to step forward instead of remaining where she had been. The image did not form fully. It did not need to. It existed only as a possibility, not regret, not desire, just another path. She let it go, not with effort, but naturally, as one releases something that no longer needs to be held. The wind strengthened slightly. The sea responded. The rhythm continued. Ellen stood there a while longer. Then, without marking the moment, she turned. The path back to the house lay open, familiar, unchanged. She walked it as she always had, carefully, steadily, the weight of salt and paper, without hurry. Behind her, the sea continued. Before her, the house waited, and within her something had settled, not into certainty, not into resolution, but into a quiet understanding that did not require either. The fog would return, the wind would rise, the lighthouse would stand, and she would remain, not unchanged, but no longer holding the past at a distance, no longer needing to. She stepped onto the porch, opened the door, entered the house,